Good evening, everyone. Welcome to 2024 Student Leadership Week. My name is Sahil Angdambe, and I am a graduate student studying regenerative medicine and entrepreneurship, and also the GA for the leadership programs in the Office of Student Activities and Leadership. We're so excited that you're all here on a Wednesday evening, so thank you so much for being here. So this week, we have a really exciting lineup of speakers and discussions aimed to inspire you and empower you to be a better leader, to be a better person and better individual, so you can make contribution in your own respective fields. So our speaker today is our esteemed speaker today is Dr. Emmett Jolly. A little bit of background about him. He has been honored and recognized for his teaching and leadership with a proclamation from the governor of Alabama and an award of leadership from the California State Senate. He has also campaigned for increased federal funding for graduate education in California, which has put him face-to-face in meetings with Senator Barbara Feinstein and Nancy Pelosi, and also the vice president at that time. He has written curriculums in science, taught bioentrepreneurship classes, which I was honored to be one of his students, and also represented scientists as the keynote speaker for the Cleveland March for Science. He has also managed millions of dollars of funding from National Institute of Health. He's an educator, he is a motivational speaker, and also an innovative thinker. So aside from that, he's also served as the president of the Shaker Heights Board of Education for 4 consecutive years. So without any further ado, help me welcome Dr. Emmett Jolly. Thank you so much for being here.
As a graduate student, as an undergraduate faculty, I'm used to organizing meetings, so I know the amount of effort and work it takes to get these things done. So kudos to you for all the work you've done, and thanks everyone for being here. So let's get started. I'm going to talk about overcoming challenges, and I'll give a few biology examples about overcoming these challenges. But first, I think I want to start off with telling you a little bit about myself. How many graduate students are in here? Most of you are graduate students. Undergraduates? Okay, this is going to be fun. I graduated from Tuskegee University. And the summer before that, each summer, I went to a summer program. And at each of these summer programs, I learned something. They all had their challenges. And I decided in the end to go to graduate school at UC San Francisco. My family didn't have much money, and so I'm moving from Alabama to San Francisco. Now, there's just slightly small amount of cultural difference between the two, and a small amount of, did I just break something? And a small amount of financial difference between the two. When I was in Alabama, I lived in Booker T. Washington's daughter's house. We rented the house for $425 a month. So now I'm looking for an apartment in San Francisco. I went from looking for an apartment in San Francisco to looking for a room in somebody else's place. There was this showing, and as part of this showing, and the way that things would happen is between 12 o'clock and 1 o'clock, they'd open up the place for people to take a look at. And so I'm looking forward to seeing how this place is going to look. I go to town, and it is a dump. It is $1,700 a month for a room. I get there, and there's a line of 50 people waiting to walk in to look at this place. It was the first time I'd ever seen anything like this. And I learned that people had first month's rent, last month's rent, deposit, and bribing money. I was broke. I was hoping to have enough to scrounge up first and deposit. In the end, after being there that summer, I went back home to Alabama, and my parents knew that I was going to be moving to San Francisco for graduate school. What I didn't tell them was that I had nowhere to go. I got on a plane, flew to San Francisco, got off with my suitcases. Fortunately for me, my girlfriend at the time was a medical student at Stanford. She picked me up from the airport. She was going to go on a retreat for Stanford Med, and I was going to borrow her car to look for a place. So I get to San Francisco, and my intention at that point was to sleep in Golden Gate Park. I didn't have a place to go. It just so happened that a friend of mine happened to know somebody who contacted somebody who contacted somebody who lived in Boston, who happened to have a house in San Francisco. And that person basically said that if I were to take care of his flowers, plants there, I could stay there until I got a place. Little did he know that I used to take care of the greenhouse when I was at Tuskegee University. So, taking care of plants, no problem at all. In a short period, I was in a place to stay. That night, I never actually slept in Golden Gate Park. I stayed there for about a week and a half before I found the cheapest rent in San Francisco. One door closed, another one opened up, so that in San Francisco at this time, I found a room that was $425 a month.
What?
3-bedroom flat right across the street from Golden Gate Park, exactly where I thought that I would be sleeping that night. Forrest Gump said, "Life is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're gonna get." And it's true. Life is challenging, life is difficult, life is hard, but life is exciting. Life is wonderful. Life is to be experienced, and it is the challenges that make you appreciate the difficulties in life. It makes you appreciate the joys that you get to have. So there was this movie I used to love. I watched it a couple of times. It was a dumb movie. Eddie Murphy was in it. And the name of it was Vampire in Brooklyn. Anybody heard of that old movie? Okay. So Eddie Murphy played a vampire. And it already tells you the humor associated with that. And one of the things he wanted to try to convince somebody he liked somebody, and then he wanted to give a sermon. But the sermon was in the church, and he pretended to be a pastor. He eventually walks in the church, he starts sweating and realizes he does not belong in a church. So he goes outside and has everyone come outside, and he did his sermon from outside. And there is a line that he said that I never forgot. Eddie Murphy, of all people, right? The character says, "If every day is a sunny day, then what's a sunny day? If we had days where there was no oxygen, then we would define things as oxygen-free and oxygen-available days. But that's every day for us. But because some days are sunny and some days are not, you appreciate those sunny days. When there are no obstacles, because of the obstacles, you appreciate when there are none." So, as I just talked about this story, about me being homeless, there's another story that falls in the same vein. But just before I get into that, I want to talk about something that people don't happen to think about, a little bit of biology, and talk about the need and the fortitude that it takes for life to persist. There are 1.3 billion cubic kilometers of water in the oceans, or 343 billion gallons of water. And inside all of this water are a mere 80,000 humpback whales. The ocean has a lot of other organisms, there are lots of other different types of shark, there are lots of different types of life. But then in these humpback whales, and also in sperm whales, there happens to be something that invades them. A tapeworm. You know, oh my goodness, a tapeworm. Matter of fact, it's a tapeworm that can reach 100 freaking feet in length. But let's ask this question. 1.3 billion cubic kilometers of water. Only so many humpback whales. How is it that the tapeworm is even capable of identifying the host that it needs to survive? I study parasites, and there are two parts to what I study. In one part, we're trying to develop treatments to address issues with parasitic infections in human beings, animals, things that we find important. On the other hand, there's a fantastical understanding of how these things work. How is it that this tapeworm that breaks off as a small proglotid that comes out of one whale now has to find a new whale in order to survive? Many of them don't make it. Most of them don't make it. But the organism keeps surviving because they've adapted to an environment where there's a scarcity of hosts by producing lots of offspring to ensure the survival of their species. They adapt to these particular challenges. I'll give you another example. Imagine if you wanted to find a partner. And what kind of partner do you want? I want somebody who wants to embrace me, who can care about me, who can carry me when I need carrying and I can support when they need supporting, who can cherish me for life, sometimes help carry me to the finish line. I only weigh 240 pounds. Somebody who can help support me become one with this particular partner. Anybody want that? Somebody like that? How do you find that person? I mean, there's 7-point-something billion people on the earth. We got plenty of options, right? That person might be right next to you. Easy to find. And yet it's a challenge. And there's this worm. Look at this. When we look at it, the first thing we go, it's a worm, man. Are you talking about a worm? And yet, what do we see here? Oh, here we go. We got a pointer. Let's see if I know how to use it. Maybe. Maybe not. I won't look at it. There we go. Okay. Look at this thing. This right here, this is the mouth. This is an acetabulum. It'll hold fast, allows us to stay in place. This gigantic worm here is the male worm on the outside. But notice this little canal in the middle of it. And then this thing sticking out here and here. One of the things about these worms is that the female, this is one of the first organisms to diverge into male and female subtypes. A lot of them are hermaphroditic, so therefore no male and no female, just hermaphroditic. In this case, this has a female worm and a male that supports her. Her development, in order for her to develop into an adult, because remember, the idea of male and females had to evolve in some particular way. She requires interaction with the male in order to develop into an adult female that produces eggs. The larger male, the more muscular male, she mates with him and he carries her in the venules. And there they pair and mate for life, producing 300 to 1,000 offspring per day. They live for up to 30 years inside a host. But how did they get into this matrimony in the first place? That's the first one. How did they meet each other over this long distance, I guess, somehow? Well, here's the story. It starts off with something like this. And it is wild. It is a wild story. How do I even start to do this properly? Let's see what my mouse do it. No, okay. Start over here, and there's these eggs that come out of the mammalian host. And there are different species of eggs for different species of hosts. Those eggs get into the water, and they immediately hatch into what are called myricydia. They just have these cilia on them that allow them to swim really fast. but they only have 6 hours to live. 6 hours. And in that 6 hours, they must find a specific species of snail to invade, or else they die. That's not a challenge, is it? No big deal, right? They find the species of snail, invade the snail, go into its liver pancreas component called a hepatopancreas, and there they transform into what are called sporocysts, just a bag of cells that are just kind of take over and integrate within the snail. The snail's living its life, and during this time, they then start producing, 6 weeks later, this cercari, this free-swimming thing with a head and a tail that exit outside of the snail only in the daytime. At nighttime, it stays inside. And the reason it does that is because the human host that it's looking for is generally out in the daytime, not at night. So they've adapted to specifically enter the host during the daytime when the host is out. That host is waiting, goes to Lake Victoria. Oh my God, look how beautiful this water is. Let me just get in it and swim. They're attracted to the skin lipids in human skin. Humans are a homing beacon, and they immediately dash, try to get to it. And we walk through the water and walk into them as they're wiggling. And eventually they get into the skin. It takes about 5 minutes. They have enzymes that they've developed that are specific for human skin. Specific for human skin, the elastin that makes our skin flexible. And that, they have an enzyme that degrades the elastin, and they swim through in about 5 minutes. As they're doing this, the tail breaks off, and the head continues to grow, to expand, eventually into a worm. It goes through the circulatory system, through the heart, through the lungs, through the heart, eventually making their way to the liver, spleen, bladder, depending on the species. There, as they're waiting, hoping that another one of them finds their way in that is of the opposite sex. But there's another barrier that I didn't even talk about. Each one of them has to get past macrophages, other components of the human immune system. If they don't get through that, they don't make it to the lungs. They don't make it to the liver. So finally, one's made it, and they're hoping that they might be able to find a partner. Eventually, a partner shows up. They find each other, and they have what I call the dating scene right there inside the mesenteric veins of your body. They pair, and there become this lovely couple who hold and cherish each other for life, producing 300 to 1,000 eggs per day that exit the body and start this cycle all over again.
How common is this, like these things entering humans?
That is a great question. The question is, how common is this? 1 out of 3 people in the world is infected with this parasite, and most Americans have never heard of it. It is the cause of schistosomiasis. So there are about 270 million people infected. The range is generally between 200 and 270, with an average of about 240 million people infected across 78 countries in the United States. In the world, 78 countries in the world. They also happen to often be species specific. So there's a bird schistosome that happens right here in the Great Lakes. And one of the challenges is, remember I told you they have to find the right host? Well, sometimes they accidentally find the wrong host. And it is the cause of swimmer's itch in the United States. Those cercari accidentally get into the human skin. Our immune system kills them off, and it leaves a little bit of a rash when our immune system kills them. And that's the swimmer's itch associated getting rid of and destroying those cercari. So they never find their partners. Thanks for the question. So there's one more. You're going to love this one. And then I'm going to talk about strategies and challenges as I tell you a couple of more stories that I think are going to be interesting. So This parasite is called Dicrocilium dendriticum. I teach parasitology here on campus. Now, this was wild. We just talked about this thing swimming through water trying to find the next host. But imagine if it's even more complicated. Imagine if you had 3 hosts to deal with. In this case, trying to find love requires, or trying to find where they need to grow requires being inside of a cow or some kind of ruminant like that. So the cow passes out through its feces some eggs. Those eggs now hanging out. Let's see if I can, here we go. Oh, this is fun. All right, this cow lays, defecates, and that defecation has a bunch of eggs. And in these eggs, you know, they're hanging out there, and you know, there's a particular animal, certain type of land snail, that likes to taste cow dung. You know, somebody has to like it, right? I mean, just go through the process, something has to happen. That snail, unknowingly, as it's having its nourishing warm meal, happens to take up some of these eggs that are found in the feces. Those eggs now enter into the snail, and inside the snail, they have to figure out how they're going to survive, because they have to find a way to get back to that cow or a cow somehow. How do they do that? And this is where the fun begins. They go through a small developmental stage inside that snail, forms what's called a myricydia that we talked about earlier, that swimming stage kind of sort of, that then becomes sporocysts. Those sporocysts then become cercariae. But notice they're cercarian, there's no water. But snails have what all over them? Slime. These snails, as they go through this development, release these slime or slime balls. No big deal, coughs it out, no harm to the snail whatsoever. How we getting to the cow again? Yeah. Ants happen to love the taste of snail slime. So, ant walks by, I'm looking for some food for the colony, I'm hungry. Sees the snail slime, and what does it do? Eats it, brings some back to the colony. Inside that snail slime are those cercariae. Those cercariae now enter into the ant, develop into what are called metacercariae, another developmental stage. Some of them go to the neurons of the brain. There's my neurobiology content right there. Okay. Go to the neurons of the brain, and there they change the ant's behavior. Instead of the ant doing what ants do every day, when the temperature drops, goes low, and in the evenings, that ant will leave the colony and go out to tall blades of grass where there are cows. And there it'll climb up to the top and lock its jaws and hang there all night until the daytime comes. The temperature goes up, and it goes back in with the rest of the colony as if nothing happened, like a zombie. And it would do this every day until eventually is eaten by a cow. At that point, the parasite is now back inside the cow. It exists, develops into a worm, and then they tell each other stories about, remember this one time I got this ant and I grabbed him by his claw, by his antennae and made him do this? Yes. Then these adults produce offspring. And the reason for these 2 stories was to talk about how even in biology, the idea of living, the effort that it takes to move forward, and the challenges and obstacles that they overcome are tremendous. But yet, somehow they find a way. I have a list here, and I call it safety. And this is for describing for personal development, for personal satisfaction. And I say that because part of the process of overcoming challenges is self-development. You overcome them, you transform in the process. The first part is that there are different kinds of challenges. Are these life challenges? Is it, for example, being homeless, being without a job? These are life challenging challenges, but we have everyday challenges. Challenges, for example, classes aren't going well. This particular class, you don't know what's going on. In each case, you first must strategize. Identify the problem. What is the challenge? Is this a consequence? My grade's going down. Why is my grades going down? It is a consequence of me not studying. Is it a consequence of me not understanding? How do you address this? So now you must develop strategy to deal with this challenge. What kind of problem is it? Is it something that you can do yourself? Develop scenarios. One of the things that I typically try to do is I try to imagine problems that have not yet happened. And that comes down because we know that people who tend to deal with challenges, difficult challenges, are more prepared for when those challenges do happen. However, we can't predict everything. As I go through this safety process, one of the things that I do want to say is that at each particular stage, be willing to go back to the beginning. And I say that because I think this thing just wants to make me feel nervous. Okay, and I say that for this reason. After we get through strategize, ask, feel yourself, think big, execute, reevaluate, and then emphatic persistence. Be willing to go back and start over and re-strategize. And I say that because there are times when you have to realize that some things you can't solve. We're going to get this right, I think. Okay. And there, if you notice, there's a small thing called acceptance. And this is where I tell you another kind of story. Graduate school for me was hard. And when I say hard, I mean hard. So there are two stories I'll tell you. One about graduate school, one as an undergraduate. Anybody heard of this guy named Jim Watson? They heard this guy Watson and Crick, something like that. Okay, so I was an undergraduate at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratories working in RNA alternative splicing, which I won't talk about for those non-biologists. But one of the things came about is a postdoc came up to me and he said, do you know that, I was like, let me step back a little bit. There's this library, beautiful library. Inside this library are all of these famous scientists. And it's one of the major places at Cold Spring Harbor where you can walk in. It's right across the street from the old cafeteria. And in there were just these hand-drawn, artistically pencil-drawn artists. You knew who they were, when they were born, etc. time frame. Postdoc comes up to me one party, we're having a good time, and he says, by the way, Emmett, did you notice that there were no black scientists in there? He's asking a black guy whether there's no black. Obviously, yes, I noticed that. First thing I noticed, because I'm the only one in this program right now. He said, well, the reason why there are none there is because Watson said he couldn't find any good black scientists. Strategize. Okay, here's the problem. How do I fix this problem? I had an idea. We had a bet, and I'll just tell you what the bet was. The bet was, I will take and put my picture in that room. I started naming a whole list of black scientists. Eventually I said, at 21, I'm a good black scientist. I go to Cold Spring, I leave there, I go to the city, I hear about this park there, Battery Park, I think somewhere like that, where they draw these pictures. Go there, find this picture, get this picture drawn. By the way, I did run into the one person that I knew in Manhattan, a guy named Joel Oppenheim, who just recently passed. He was Associate Dean for the School of Medicine. Randomly walked into him, 8 million people in New York on the streets. I asked him where this park was. He gives me directions. He cracks up about the whole story. I then go there, get the picture drawn, come back, leave the city, catch the train back to Cold Spring Harbor. I put my picture in the dead center on the centermost pillar in that room. Because I wanted to make a point. Days go by. They have these national meetings at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratories. All of these people show up. People start seeing me and say, oh, I saw your picture there. And I kind of say, hey, you know, I didn't really do anything. I identified some factors in alternative splicing, and that's pretty much it. They assume I'm being modest. Before you know it, it gets back to Watson. The picture ended up back in my laboratory. And I had a note that said, by the way, he got it. My strategy was to do this with the hope that he might get it. That the hope that it might make an impact. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But this was the challenge at the particular time. When I was a graduate student, and this gets to something that's more relevant to those taking classes, graduate school was hard. We had this class called Bioregulatory Mechanisms, and it was considered the hardest class at UCSF. And the first round was really, really hard, and I didn't know what to do. Part number 2, ask for help. Ask for support. You find out that most of the time we try to go through these things. When things get hard, we tend to isolate ourselves. We tend to disappear. And it's those times when we need to reach out and find support and other people who care. For the first time in my life, I had a study group. I always studied alone. I met with 2 of my classmates. We met every day. We talked about the class. And I ended up doing very well in that class in the end. The hardest class they had is the one I actually did the best in. The rest of them I kind of did okay, I passed. Ask for help. Sometimes learning what other people would have done or can do is exceptionally important to help you get through your challenge. And there are different types, and I will just say there are different types of challenges. I'm naming a few, but they can be extrapolated to different types depending on what kind of challenge it is. Is it a personal challenge? Is it a major life challenge? The next line I have to say is, feel yourself. Ask yourself questions. How important is this to you? What would your older self think if you aren't successful in this particular challenge? You know, you're going, your car breaks down. What do you do? I got to get to class. Class is challenging. What do you do? How do you overcome this challenge? How do you deal with this? You're just broke. How do you deal with being broke? This is a life challenge. But in the end, what would your older self say to you about this challenge? Oh, just don't worry about it. You know, you'll be fine. Don't worry about class anymore. Just give up. Is that what your older self would be comfortable with? And as we go through life, I think it is important that we ask ourselves that question over and over and over and over again. What would my older self think about me at this moment? I said grad school was hard. So I got through my first year. First African American in that program, which I thought at my stage there should not be any more first. When I was in high school, I had a genetics instructor, biology instructor, who loaned me a microscope, one of the school microscopes, to go home and explore. I grew up in a really small town. And so I looked to this guy a lot because of how much effort he put in to make sure that I got access to the school microscope to take home and study stink bugs and flies and whatever else I could find in the woods. So my second year of graduate school, Mr. Ledbetter died. Of course, I get a phone call. I learn about it. I'm sad, obviously. And of course, I'm concerned about that. School will continue. And I've had my now challenge in school. I've already done with the homeless thing. I've worked my butt off to get through the first year. Second year, Mr. Ledbetter dies. And then after that, I keep working. Because my intention is to graduate as the first African American in this program. And then in my fourth year of graduate school, I was working on identifying the master regulator of mitosis. My thesis advisor, a guy by the name of Ira Hershkowitz, calls me into his office. He says, Emmett, I want to talk to you. And I'll tell you, all you graduate students, you bear with me on this one. I've got some good news and some bad news. You don't want your thesis advisor to say that usually. So I said, tell me the bad news first, because I want to feel good after you tell me the good news. So he pulls out this paper. This group from Stanford and Cold Spring Harbor somehow found the master regulator of mitosis by accident. It was a fork-head box protein. He shows me the paper because he was an editor for Cell and a MacArthur Award winner and all these other things. And so everybody would send him stuff as a yeast geneticist. And I look at this, and this is everything that I had done, plus stuff I had never thought of. There was no coming back from this. I was not publishing my work anywhere because it was already there. So now I am done. 4th year, thinking I'm going to graduate. So I said, okay, so what's the good news? And you know how you work with really smart people and they're like so smart that his answer was, at least you know that you were right. You know, I didn't want to know that I was right. I wanted the rest of the world to know that I was right, which is very different. I then had to start over from scratch with my PhD in biochemistry and molecular biology with a subspecialty in genetics. I started over and started working on meiosis. Now, these are the moments where you go, okay, I've just about had enough, okay? I don't know if I can deal with any more. So I started working on meiosis. I then became an expert in what? Alternative careers to science. Because I've been beat. I'm going to come up with a way of getting out of this. My mother was home, and since I was in high school, she had been diagnosed with lupus. And that year the day I was supposed to go meet Watson at Cold Spring Harbor, I got a phone call that my dad was going into the emergency room. So now I have 2 sick parents back in Alabama. My dad recovering, my mother still has lupus. And I just flown to Alabama. My wife was obviously a medical student. We'd just gone to see my mother who had gone to the hospital. Her lupus and scleroderma, both autoimmune diseases, which is one of the reasons I wanted to initially study autoimmune diseases. Go there to talk to our doctors and find out what's going on and make sure to visit and know what's happening with my mother. My father was driving, they were in the hospital in Birmingham. My father drove back and forth from Tuskegee to Birmingham every day, which is about 2.5 hours. So he would leave work, drive to the hospital, stay there all night, drive to work the next day. And he did this every day for several months. This one day, my mother calls me on the phone and she says, son, you know, just wants to talk to you. Just want to see how you were doing. Just want to tell you that I love you. I'm like, oh, well, Mom, I love you too. I'm just thinking about you. I'm walking into lab at that very moment. I'm telling her it's a sunny day, et cetera, et cetera. A couple hours later, I get a phone call that my mother passed away. And at that point, I don't know what to do. Because at every turn, something kept happening. A new obstacle popped in the way. And how am I supposed to react? I remember telling one person in lab, I said, by the way, I just need to let you know my mother just passed away. I'm gonna have to leave for the day. And I had to go home to try to get myself together and start the process of trying to get home and prepare for the funeral with my dad and 3 brothers. I had to ask for help because I was hurting. I didn't know what to do. That is where you grab family, you grab older people, grab mentors. And I went home, and it was one of the largest funerals I'd ever been to. It's over 1,000 people at her funeral. They couldn't get enough. They didn't have space in the church for her because of the number of people that she touched. And of course, obviously, while I was in my mourning, that touched me. So then I have to go back to school, or I could quit right now. And he decided, yeah. So now I got to make some decisions because life is really throwing some curveballs. I then go back to school. I go back to UCSF, back to San Francisco, and I'm going to try to get this process going. I need to move forward. And so I start working on this paper, now the master regulator of meiosis, and I get scooped a second time. Someone else, half of my stuff gets scooped, someone else publishes half of it. And I'm thinking, I am never getting out of here. At this point, I said, you know, I gotta roll. I started looking at those alternative jobs. I ended up getting a job with this major law firm. I was going to do intellectual property law. They were going to make me the scientific advisor and pay for law school. So I just told you the reason why I ended up not going to the law firm was because after I decided to go there, the day I have my thesis committee meeting, I'm about to be finished, graduate, I've done the last thing. The paper comes out that scoops half of my stuff. I tell it to my committee and they say, you can't graduate because you gotta be able to publish this. That was Monday. Tuesday, the law firm calls me. Congratulations, we'd like to welcome you to blank, 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 and blank. And we'd like for you to be the scientific advisor for the US pending completion of your PhD. I then had to say, well, I'm sorry, I gotta go back and finish some more experiments. And that was the end of that. That didn't feel good. I'm just gonna be honest. You wanna talk about challenges. So I go back and I'm back at it. We're gonna get this done. I'm gonna get this, I'm gonna graduate, I'm gonna finish this. And I thought it was over. My thesis advisor got diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. The whole lab went into mourning. He goes through chemo. He gets better, thank goodness. He goes back, he's starting to play tennis again, everything's great. A year later, he goes back, he gets diagnosed, and it is now everywhere. He passed away a couple of months later. So now I have to move to another lab. So I moved to another lab that worked in microbiology, a lady who was on my thesis committee, Carol Gross. And now I'm working in yeast genetics in a microbiology lab. At this point, I decide I'm absolutely not doing academic science. So I had this company that I was working for, Invitrogen, which I ended up talking to this guy, and he was offering me a job there to run West Coast sales for this biotech company. I was ecstatic. And I knew where I was going because now I'm going to graduate and I'm getting out of here and I'm going to do something completely different because I could sell anything. Just before I graduate, they got a new CEO. Anybody know what happens when you get a new CEO for a biotech company?
Everything changes.
Everything changes. The first thing was a hiring freeze. And now, not knowing whether that position would even exist, at that point it didn't exist anymore. And now I have to decide, what am I going to do with my future? What strategy do you come up with that? So I said, well, I'm at UCSF, top places in the country. I'm around some of the best minds in the world. Let me think about what I want to do with this yeast genetics, biochemistry stuff that I've learned in transcriptional regulation. In the end, I decided to look at some labs, and I joined the lab, and I said I would give myself my strategy 1 year. And if I didn't like it, I have my degree. I can go back into industry. I ended up going back to this lab. Enjoyed it. A guy named James McCarroll, who ended up eventually, after I left there, he ended up becoming dean of the Skaggs School of Pharmacy in San Diego. And I did well. And I was still thinking about, got into venture capital, still thinking about industry. And Jim said, I think you need to look at some academic jobs. And I just laughed at him in his face right there because there are no jobs. And then I said, fine, I'll do it. And I started getting hits. Before you know it, one of those hits happened to be here, where I happened to have lived until I was 7 years old and had family. And you want to talk about how sometimes the world has twists in it? While I'm here interviewing and I'm getting a phone call from another place who's trying to recruit me, my father calls me. He says, "Hey, Dad, how you doing?" And he says, "Hey, son, how are you doing?" I said, "I'm in Cleveland now." He said, "Oh, okay, great. What are you doing there?" And I said, "Well, I'm interviewing, but I wanted to ask you this question. When I was a kid here, you used to take us to this place where there were these koi, and we would feed the koi bread. Where was that, Dad?" And he said 4 words that I'd never, ever heard him say in my whole life. He said, "Son, that was at Case Western Reserve University." I said, "What?" He said, "Yeah, there's this lake over there right by the museum or something, the place where they played music. And me and your mom used to take you guys over there. And when we were dating, we would walk around that lake." At this point, I am freaking out because I'm sitting in the middle of Case Western going, is this what I'm supposed to do? Is this the sign that I'm supposed to get? And too many things aligned where I decided to come here. In all of this situation, one of the things that I thought was so important was I understand that life is hard, but regardless of how hard it gets, it is critical to keep a positive outlook. It is okay for life to be challenging and difficult. Matter of fact, there's an article in 2010 called "Fortune Favors the Bold: Effects of Disfluency on Educational Outcomes," where they said by making things a little bit more difficult, so the way they actually did this study was they decided to make it harder for students to read in a font for them to read what they were supposed to learn. You're like, why would you do that? What they found out was that the students who had the more difficult font, the more challenged, were the ones who learned it more effectively. 85% on average relative to the others who were much less, which is crazy to imagine. But creating obstacles in some ways changes the way we learn, changes the way we think, changes who we are. And in this case, it made them better at the things that they were trying to learn. One of the things that was mentioned earlier was that I was president of the Shaker Heights School District, which is right down the street. And this is in line with this think big and keep a positive outlook, because as you know, during COVID, it was crazy to be on anybody's school board at the time. I'll say we got through it. But then there was another challenge. And the challenge was, this is a district that has a lot of taxes. Our buildings were starting to fall apart. And we were going to propose, and one of the proposals that was proposed to the board was this idea of building new buildings and tearing down some of the community schools for a larger one. At least this is what the consultants proposed. In the end, the community went crazy. They were like, "There is no way you are doing this to our schools, and you people are crazy," and so and so. And it was one of the most interesting things, because the reality is I'm elected by the community. They voted me in, and we're trying to do what is both equitable and right, but also right for the school district. Things were wild. There were protests, there were communities, neighborhood protests. People were standing out in front of schools. People were setting up extra meetings to talk about and scream at various people about various things. And in the end, we had to find a way to solve this problem. First thing you do, strategize. Learn as much information as you can. What are the symptoms? What are the causes? Eventually, I went and met with each member of the school board. We had a plan. The plan was to keep our neighborhood schools, to remodel each of those schools instead of destroying them, to then work on remodeling the new schools. Eventually, we came up with a great plan that was eventually supported by the district, and angry people went away mostly, and we ended up passing the largest bond that has ever been passed in the community's history. And starting this year, they're starting the process of remodeling buildings that architects use as a model for how a community should be designed. I feel really proud about the work that we did for that school district as part of a board and with an amazing superintendent and school district. In the end, we found a way to execute on the choices that we had. And in all cases, remember how I started? Always go back to re-strategize, to re-evaluate. And once you have made your decision, emphatically persist in making it happen. And then reevaluate and go back up and strategize. My father used to tell me, I'm a preacher's kid, so he always had stories to tell. And I'm going to tell you two quick stories. One of them has to do with this whole process of thinking. And he always pushed us to think, and not only to think, but to think differently. And he said there was this little boy, little Johnny. And why is everybody named Little Johnny? I don't know. But he was Little Johnny. He said Little Johnny was in school. And people would walk up to Johnny and say, Johnny, by the way, which has more value, a nickel or a dime? And little Johnny would be like, grab the nickel, the nickel, the nickel, the nickel. And they'd look at him and they'd laugh at him. And once it started happening, everybody wanted to see how stupid little Johnny was, right? Clearly. Hey, which one's more valuable, the nickel or the dime? The nickel, the nickel, the nickel. Next thing you know, little Johnny goes home and they called his dad. And his dad is upset because his son does not know the difference of which one's more valuable, a nickel or a dime. And just because the nickel's bigger does not mean that it is worth more. So he calls his son, Johnny, I've heard some things about you in school. Now I want to know which one of these is worth more, the nickel or the dime? Little Johnny grabs a nickel. Johnny, you know that a nickel is not worth more than a dime. A dime is worth more than a nickel. And little Johnny looks up at his dad with those big, gigantic eyes. And then he reaches in his pocket and pulls out an entire pocket of nickels. And he said, Dad, if I said that the dime was worth more, the game would be over. For little Johnny, the nickel was worth more than the dime. So sometimes we have to think differently in how we address challenges, how we address problems. And in the end, I'll end with one last story. Another one of my dad's stories, go figure. He said there was this African boys, they grew up in an African small village, and one had gone off to the United States to get his education. And so he comes back with his American education. Grabs his friend, and he says, hey, let's play a trick on the old wise man. What we'll do is we'll grab a bird and we'll put the bird in our hand. And and we'll ask him, is the bird alive or is it dead? And if he says that the bird is dead, we'll open our hands and let the bird fly free. And if he says that the bird is alive, we'll crush it and show him that the bird is dead. Oh, they walk up, they're like, we got this guy now. They walk up to the old wise man and they ask him a simple question, old wise man, is this bird, is it dead or alive? And the old wise man, remembering them as these children that they were, looks at them and says, it's in your hands. It's in your hands. How you see challenges and difficulties, how you perceive them, Are they positive or negative? Do they help develop you and mold you to the next person so that you get personal development and personal satisfaction in the end? It's in your hands. And I'll stop with that. Thank you for your attention. I appreciate you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jolly. I really appreciate all the stories and insights. I'm sure like through the challenges you might have spiraling thoughts of things not working out or things being hard and challenging. And my question to you is, how do you deal with those spiraling thoughts? Like, how do you put an end to it?
It's a really good question. And I got to tell you, there were moments when I would walk the half mile to campus. And as I walked to campus, I got sadder and sadder. And in the evening, as I walked back home, I got happier and happier. And at the time, I didn't really know what was going on. And it took talking a lot to different people. The first thing I did was I isolated myself, which I said is not the thing to do. And I can tell you from experience, it's not the thing to do. But I started finding things that were positive in my life. So I played basketball. So because I played basketball, we were winning we won the championship for basketball at UCSF. I had to find things that in the midst of all of the things that were wrong were now good. I had to find the good in my life. During this time in graduate school, I met the love of my life and got married. During this time in graduate school, I had a daughter who is actually a senior here at Case Western, graduating this year, and I think was vice president last year. These are the good things that happen in my life, and so finding those things that make me happy was essential. I played tournament pool, and I got really good at it. Those things gave me a different type of joy. And then interacting and doing community service, investing in people at the same time, those things fed me a joy that I just, had it not been for doing those things, engaging and talking with people, community service, I think it would have been a very different story. Thanks for that question.
I didn't introduce myself, but I'm Sakshi. I'm a graduate student as well.
Hello, Sakshi.
But nice to meet you. Thank you.
Too.
Just remember that we have time for, we have food and then we have time for networking, so you can connect with Dr. Jolly, ask him questions, or like connect amongst each other, expand your network, and so forth. But before you get off the stage,
I was about to run too.
we have a little token of appreciation for your time being here. So thank you so much.
Oh, great.
Thank you.
Thanks, man.
Thank you. Thank you, each and every one of you, for being here. I know your commitment is acknowledged, and whatever takeaways that you've been getting from this week will come to fruition. So I know each and every session has been attacking leadership, professional development from different angles. So I'm sure that you're receiving your own version of takeaway. So when you're so you can apply that in your studies, or when you go on to pursue your career. So thank you so much. Each and every one of you is appreciated for being here and for your time.